Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Ward. I work for Mastercard, and I will be telling you, I was going to say all about security for card payments, but I'll actually probably just be giving you a very restricted overview and plunging into some details where I can. So Mastercard, as actually Bart described quite nicely this morning, it enables card payments insofar as if you have a Mastercard card, then you are able to go and buy stuff at a merchant who also would accept Mastercard. And that could be a merchant in another country. So that's kind of interesting. I'm going to focus on face-to-face payments. So no e-commerce, I'm afraid, no agentic payments. Don't expect any of that. What I will furthermore focus on, though, is the protocol that takes place between the card and the terminal and ultimately to the issuing bank when a payment actually takes place. If we look at the table of contents, I've divided it into 7 sections. And just for your advanced information, the main part I'm going to focus on really when I get to it is the cryptography and key management in the middle there. The first 3 parts I'm going to rattle through fairly quickly, so please don't be too alarmed when you see the slides flashing in front of your face. But I won't rattle through the final 3 sections, unless, of course, I've completely run out of time, but I don't think I will. So let's get started. So this slide shows you an overview of the evolution of card payments since the 1970s. As far as chip transactions are concerned, they kind of kicked off in the mid-1990s, again to Bart's presentation, when PKI was getting really popular. We saw the contact chip technology being introduced, and then 10 years later, contactless, and then more recently, showing my age, mobile payments. It's interesting, I think, to note on this slide that Magstripe technology is still there. If you've got a bank card, it will have probably still have a Magstripe on it. Most do. And you will still be able to make a Magstripe transaction. Now, your issuing bank might have decided not to accept them anymore, especially in Europe. But there are a lot of US banks that will still be accepting Magstripe transactions. The US was slightly later to the game, so to speak, when it came to moving from Magstripe to chip. As you can see at the bottom of the slide, there's a focus on some of the cardholder verification methods. These are clearly very important as part of the 2-factor authentication. We have online PIN, bottom left, and that was been around even since the time of Magstripe. It's not dependent on chip technology. However, for chip, what chip does do is introduce the possibility of offline PIN. So that's where the PIN, as entered by the cardholder, is sent directly to the card, and the card itself is able to verify whether it's valid or not. With contactless transactions, we don't allow offline PIN. You can do online PIN, but you can't do offline PIN bits because the security is considered to be inadequate for sending the PIN over a contactless interface. And moreover, actually, the contactless interface would be vulnerable to so-called probing attacks by anyone trying to guess your PIN when your card is in your pocket. And of course, with mobile, we have consumer device CVM. So that's where you have Face ID or fingerprint on your phone. I'll say a few more words on those technologies later on. But for the time being, let's do a bit of rattling through the slides. So I'm going to start with some slides on the Magstripe. So I think you'll probably be glad that I'm not going to spend too long on Magstripe technology. But back in the day, you were able to do all payments just by having your Magstripe swiped. There was very little security associated with that. And it was found actually that, yes, you could subvert the security by just generating valid looking account numbers. In the cards world, by the way, we call account numbers, we call them PANs for primary account number, and I'll probably say the word PAN quite a lot during this presentation. And the way to get around those kinds of attacks is to embed a 3-digit cryptogram, basically, a 3-digit MAC. The issuer generates it before issuing the Magstripe card, and they put it onto the card, and only the issuer will be able to verify that MAC. But that MAC, that CVC1 cryptogram, is static. So actually anyone with a skimming device can just copy your Magstripe and replay it. So clearly that is not a good security solution. And in fact, around about that time, you'll see in the top right of this slide, 36% in the UK, 36% of card fraud losses were counterfeit. So that's skimming fraud. And that gives you an understanding, I think, for why, especially in Europe, there was a move to introducing chip. A lot of Europe actually already did have chip, but for the UK, it was the UK had not had chip, and this was very much a motivator to introduce chip and PIN, also to tackle the 34% lost and stolen fraud by introducing PIN at point of sale, because the UK didn't have PIN at point of sale historically back then. It didn't even have online PIN. It was all handwritten signature, very much like the US. So this slide shows you all of the security features that were increasingly added to card technology, payment card technology. So in fact, the payment card, in some sense, was an addition to a check, enabling you to compare a handwritten signature with the signature on the check. Then you had embossing, so that's where you have not just printed information on the card, the printed PAN, but it's embossed, so it's raised up above the level of the plastic. That enables it to be swiped, zip-zap machines, you may have heard of them. Then you have a Magstripe added to it. That enables you to put extra information that can be electronically captured, along with a CVC1. I've jumped the gun there. So first of all, you have a hologram. So cards still have holograms, which is kind of interesting. Increasingly, they're moving to the back of the card rather than being on the front. So then you have the 3-digit cryptogram being put into the card, and that's on the Magstripe. For e-commerce, you do also and still do have a 3-digit printed cryptogram called, well, Mastercard calls them CVC2, and that's used for e-commerce transactions still. And finally, of course, we get to having a chip on the card. Now, the chip is a wonderful thing, but it does need to be secured. Once you're putting secret keys into the card, because that's what obviously happens in order to have card authentication, then you do need to protect those keys and a whole lot of other stuff. But before I say a few words on that, let's talk a bit about what you can do with the intelligence that you now have in the card, and actually in the terminal, the merchant's terminal as well. They can both manage some of the risk associated with the payment transaction and possible attacks that might take place. So the terminal can make some decisions, do some risk management in terms of when will it accept the transaction offline, by which I mean accept it locally without sending it on the transaction online to the issuing bank. If there's been a cryptogram failure, for example, then that would be a reason why the terminal actually would want to either decline or send the transaction online and let the issuer decide, because there may be good reasons why the local cryptogram failed, and the issuer bank might feel that acceptance for the customer is more important than security and fraud, and legitimately so. On the card side, there are counters that can be implemented. So the card can count how many transactions it has done since going online to the issuing bank. And after, say, 5 transactions, or after, say, 200 euros spend, it will force a transaction to go online to the issuing bank. So there's quite a lot of intelligence that you can put on the card. And the card can actually, the issuer can fine-tune those thresholds for when the card will require to go online. I won't go into the details of this, partly because nowadays almost all transactions do go online to the issuer. It's really because the technology is there, especially with the internet. Back 20 years ago, it wasn't the case. The US had good internet connectivity coming on. In Europe, we didn't. And so it was important to have these offline controls because a lot of transactions were offline. Nowadays, though, we have what are called zero merchant floor limits. That means that every transaction goes online. There are exceptions, and we'll talk about that, but for the time being, just take it that most transactions do go online. Also on the card, and benefits in terms of risk management, is there's a transaction counter on the card that gets incremented every time a transaction is performed. And clearly that is like a heartbeat for the card, and can be used for doing so-called velocity checking and other card risk management. We've got the secret keys. So these are symmetric keys and public keys, by which I mean the private, importantly, the private part of the public key pair that has to be kept secret and secured against side channel attacks. And for contact cards, so that's where you actually have to dip your card into the merchant's terminal, we have the possibility, as I mentioned earlier, of doing offline PIN. So that's where the PIN is not sent online to the issuing bank for verification, but rather it's submitted locally. And the card itself can give a yes/no as to whether the PIN is correct or not. It's interesting to note that in the early days of this technology, that PIN was always sent in plain text to the card. It was only more recently that it was encrypted. It's only a short journey between the merchant's PIN pad and the card, but originally it was plain text, but now it is actually encrypted. But of course, in the chip on the card, there's a lot of complexity, and functionality, which is great. But these chips are very constrained, and we'll see some consequences of those constraints, certainly going back 20 years ago. And not only that, but they need to be protected. The secret keys need to be protected against attacks. And I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but there's yes, you can just see by scanning through it, in the life cycle of a chip and the chip on the card, there's a huge amount of stuff that needs to be done. Security evaluations, very clever implementation designs from chip vendors, chip manufacturers. And this is all so that at the end of the day, you can have a card holder who can buy stuff at merchants. And as Bart mentioned earlier this morning, in fact, in this case, the card is actually in the hands of, or in the mouth of, the card holder. And potentially the card holder, though, is not honest. They could try and attack the card. They could try and do their own DPA attacks on it, glitching attacks. And so the security that's given to the secret keys in the chip has got to be really good. So in order to get that all happening, a specification was established called the EMV specification. And I'll say a few words about that. And relating to the EMV specification are other security standards. As far as the specifications are concerned, EMV developed 4 books, books 1 to 4, and this is all for contact, so where you stick the card into the reader. Contactless came later. Books 1 to 4. Book 2 was the book that dealt with the security and cryptography, and we'll do a little deep dive into that in a minute. And EMV also, though, and it's easy, that's easy for me to forget because I focus on the security so much, but EMV also importantly does the evaluation, not of, it does security evaluation, but it does the functional evaluation to make sure that the cards and terminals can talk to each other. Because as you all know, you can take your card to another part of the world and it will work. And it's not like it's a card talking to another card. These are different devices from different vendors. And it does work. So that's called the type approval testing that EMV does. Also the kernel, that's the terminal software, it's the same. The functionality of that kernel for contact transactions is always the same. However, the functionality within the card can be different. Every card has to be able to talk to the terminal software, but it can do so in a different way. And each payment system has their own card specifications for this. Having said that, EMV does also define what's called the common payment application for those issuing banks who wish to implement it. Contactless came on later, and the way in which contactless happened is that each payment system developed their own specs independently, which in a way was a shame, but that was the commercial realities at the time. It was extremely competitive, which means that although the contactless specifications were kind of similar because they were sort of based on the contacts approach, the architecture, they were different. And it's only just recently that we've got a common contactless specification that's called C-8, and where the cryptography is specified in Book E, and I'll say a bit about that in a minute. And for contactless, EMV does not offer a common card spec. It's only for contact, but it does that. A few words about EMV. EMV is, or EMV Co, I should say. Its members are American Express, listed on the right there, Discover, JCB, Mastercard, Union Pay, and Visa. So JCB, by the way, is Japan, Union Pay, China. And for completeness, Amex American, Discover American, Mastercard American, Visa American. And EMV Co has grown, though, in terms of its scope. So face-to-face payments. At the start, it was just contact. Then it introduced contactless and, by extension, mobile payments for face-to-face. It also covers QR code payments. something called tokenization, which I'll say a bit more about later, but it's a way in which you can create a random card number. Yeah, I'll say a bit more about that later. And remote payments, so something called 3D secure and secure remote commerce. So here we're talking e-commerce. That's what we mean by remote payments. Unfortunately, I should mention, and I hope I don't come a cropper on this during my presentation, but the number of words at our disposal is finite. Well, it certainly feels it. And so sometimes we do struggle with using the same words that get used for different things. Remote payments is one of them. Often nowadays in face-to-face payments, the remote payment it's a remote authorization to the card issuer. It's not e-commerce. Online, we know online. We use that word in face-to-face payments for the issuer authorization, but clearly online in other contexts means internet and e-commerce. Anyway, also I've got a forward reference here to PCI SSC. I'll say a bit more about that shortly. So very, very briefly, EMVCo does a range of things. I've mentioned the specifications. I've mentioned the approval and evaluation. It also deals with the marks, so the symbols that appear. So you've got, for example, here the contactless payments symbol. That is relevant to today's presentation. And also collaboration with industry stakeholders. So we do have an outreach to banks and to technology vendors to get their feedback on how best to proceed with the evolution and development of the specifications. This slide, by the way, these few slides here are all actually on the EMVCo website. If you go to that website and look at About, you'll find these stats. And in fact, you won't find the this one here because this dates back to 2013, 2014. So I've kept this one from back then. But you'll find the last year's stats on the website today. I'm not going to go into any details, but you can see the trends there, and I suppose you can see how the US were somewhat late to the game, but they've caught up. So they're at 95.5% adoption now. And in fact, you can see that chip really is, it's fully there. It's arrived. There are very few non-chip transactions that take place. This shows a map with more information. I'm not going to go into the details. Again, you can see this on the web. And this slide shows it's a related organization called PCI SSC, Security Standards Council, and they do a lot of the security evaluation, not of the chip cards, but of the terminals and all of the other surrounding key management devices that are needed. Pin security, pin pads, a whole host of other things. And this is just actually a screenshot of their home page, just to list the kinds of things that PCI do. It's a big topic. I'm not going to go into that. What I am now going to go into is the cryptography and key management. So in an EMV chip transaction, you've got these players who are participating. So you've got, where to start? You've got the card issuer, the bank, who normally, or typically a bank, who will issue a payment card to its card holders. You've got merchants who will be selling stuff or services to the cardholders, they will have a bank actually who the acquiring bank is needed not just to make sure that the merchant gets paid, but also to handle the processing of transactions, as you can see by the orange arrows. If it's an international transaction, it will certainly need to go through the payment schemes networks. So that's like Mastercard or Visa or any of the other payment schemes. And this would be, these orange arrows indicate the online authorization. So as I mentioned before, almost all transactions nowadays are online authorized. Only the very low value transactions might be offline authorized, and so would only then you would only see conversation happening between the card and the merchant. Almost always nowadays, the conversation will involve the issuing bank. Apart from anything else, the issuing bank wants to see what the credit status is of the cardholder. So, and it's good business for them to keep in touch with the spending habits of their cardholders, I guess. Oh, and there's a couple of other players. So you have a token service provider, particularly relevant for mobile transactions and e-commerce. I'll say a few more words about mobile, but both for mobile and for e-commerce, instead of using the PAN, the account number that's printed on the front of the plastic card, although actually nowadays it's often printed on the back of the card. Instead of using that account number, a token service provider will create a new random account number called a token and use that instead of the PAN. The PAN is sometimes called the FPAN, meaning the financial PAN, and the token is sometimes called a DPAN, which is a digital PAN. Anyway, it does mean, though, that if you capture the token, it's not going to help you do a plastic card payment. It's only, for example, if it's a mobile phone token, you can only use it for a mobile phone transaction. But even then you couldn't, because you would need the secret keys in the mobile phone in order to authenticate. By the way, most, if not all, mobile phone transactions, so if the cardholder taps their mobile phone, that will always go online to the issuing bank. It's only plastic card-based ones, and especially contact transactions, that might stay offline, broadly speaking. The other player here is a service provider, so a lot of issuers will use bureaus who will help them do not just the authorization of transactions, but also the personalization, the provisioning of cards with the keys and the data before being issued to the cardholder. And similarly, acquirers might also use service providers. So what happens then for the use of public key cryptography? Particularly important for local authentication or offline transactions. We have a PKI. The payment scheme has a key pair, the card issuer has a key pair, and you won't be surprised to hear that the payment scheme certifies the issuer's public key using the payment system's private key. And then the issuer does the same, but for their cards. So you end up with an issuer certificate and a card certificate. And of course, the card in the card will actually also have a key pair. But for the transaction, for the merchant to be able to then use this PKI, it has to have the payment scheme's public key, so that has to be distributed to all the terminals. Now when the merchant gets a signature from the card, it can use the payment scheme public key that it has received via a trusted channel, via its acquirer, and verify the chain of certificates, and then verify the card's signature. One tiny point, no, not a tiny point, an important point regarding trust models. So yes, this is a trust model, and to Bart's comment earlier this morning, it's the biggest PKI, consumer-sided PKI in the world, or it certainly was for a long time. What's important, though, to understand from this is the trust. And what we get from this PKI, it's one-sided, it's not two-sided. So what we get is the merchant can then trust signatures from the card. There's nothing in this that enables the cardholder to trust the merchant. And that's quite important to be aware of. Then, as I said, the card is personalized with the key pair and public key certificates. And it can then use all of this to do local authentication to the merchant. Yes? PIN code. Yes and no. That wouldn't happen basically normally, because normally the issuing bank would, when they issue the cardholder with their new card and PIN code, they'll do them separately. They'll do them spaced out in time, so typically 2 or 3 days between. And when the PIN code comes, you wouldn't be able to see that it's a banking PIN code.
What I mean is, if, for example, you would see the Mastercard logo in both.
Well, you wouldn't. You wouldn't.
I can assure you, you would.
Okay.
I can show you that you will not be happy because Mastercard has sent those envelopes.
Okay. I'd like to speak to you afterwards. Also what happens, I mean, obviously as technology evolves, I think increasingly what happens is that the PIN is actually not sent in the post to the cardholder. They actually get to see it in the app once they've securely authenticated to the app using the recently delivered plastic card. So there are various ways you can do this, but I certainly I agree that what you're talking about doesn't seem ideal, but maybe there's something in it which compensates for that. Anyway, so that's the public key cryptography. For the cardholder verification, I mentioned a bit about this earlier. There are various ways to authenticate the cardholder. No CVM, you'll see there is a valid way of having ironically a CVM. But for contactless transactions, you don't. Contactless card transactions, you'll only 1 in every 5 transactions have to put a PIN in, or maybe in some countries you'll do a handwritten signature. You don't do a PIN for every transaction. With CD-CVM, of course, and I think a lot of the reason why people are using mobile phones for doing card transactions nowadays is because you don't have to do a PIN. You just do some on-device authentication, which is very easy, frictionless, and you can make your payment. However, there are regulations. So the PSD2 regulation, you can obviously find out more on the internet about this regulation, but in a nutshell, they say that for contactless transactions, there's a cap of 50 euros for an individual transaction, 150 euros or 5 consecutive transactions for cumulative CVM-less contactless transactions. So you need to do an online PIN or transfer to a contact offline PIN in order to refresh your counters. Or you can use CD-CVM. Cardholder authentication, there are 3 flavors defined by the EMV specification. So there's SDA, static data authentication. That's actually not used anymore. It was subject to replay attacks. It was just there for the early days when RSA was too expensive to have the card processed. But now, with the advent of co-processors, I mean, we're talking 15 years ago, to be honest, we've moved to DDA, dynamic data authentication, and the CDA, and I'll say a bit more about those 2 methods shortly, maybe even the next slide. But in a nutshell, DDA, the card just simply signs a random challenge, whereas CDA, the card signs not just the random challenge, but all of the transaction data. And that means that it's not vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks between the card and the terminal. Before we get onto that, though, just a few words, which we haven't actually said much about. I haven't said much about until now, which is this use of symmetric cryptography, where yeah, I'm glad Bart isn't paying any attention at the moment. I've got the word encryption written here. It's really absolutely not encryption. It's actually closer to a MAC calculation, but it is actually a specific key derivation method. So for the symmetric cryptography, the issuing bank will have an issuer master key, and it will then derive a card master key to be personalized into the card. And that will essentially be done by encrypting the card's account number. And then when the card goes to the merchant terminal to make a transaction, it will derive a session key by encrypting the card's transaction counter, and then that session key will be used for generating a cryptogram that can be sent back to the issuer and verified by the issuer. For mobile phones, it's slightly different. With mobile phones, instead of, and this is not universal, but certainly some instances of mobile phones will use, instead of having a card master key provisioned into it, it will be provisioned with a bunch of session keys. And it will use those session keys for a number of transactions. When it's used them all up, it will ask to be replenished, and it will get another set of session keys downloaded to it. So that's the way that works. So now we get into looking at a particular transaction. So what we have here is a card on the left. This could be a mobile phone, though, but I've illustrated it as a card. The first thing that would happen is the terminal would send a random challenge to the card, and the card would use its private key to sign it. This is called DDA. It's not all cards do DDA. Mastercard cards actually do CDA, which will be shown later. They happen later, and CDA signatures happen later in the transaction, because it's only later in the transaction that you've got transaction data to sign. So the next thing that might happen in a transaction is that if it's a contact card, then it could be sent, normally would be sent, a PIN from the PIN pad to the card for verification. So that's the second of the two arrows there. It'll be encrypted under the card's public key. And that is, yeah, that's a proper encryption. Notice there is a random challenge there, because the card wants to ensure that whatever it receives back is a freshly encrypted PIN. So in fact what happens is the random challenge is included in the encrypted PIN payload, and the card will be able to check that and ensure that it's a freshly encrypted PIN. Then the final thing that happens between the card and the terminal, well, not quite the final thing, but normally the final thing, certainly for a contactless transaction, it's the final thing, which is the terminal will send a card, it will send a command to the card, and the card will create a signature on its response, and the response will include what's called an application cryptogram. And that's a symmetric MAC that the issuer can verify. Because normally the transaction will, and certainly for contactless transactions, it will go online to the issuer, who will then be able to verify the MAC and either authorize or not the transaction. I found it quite interesting in the software security presentation this morning that some of the stages, the 4 stages, are very similar to some of the stages in an EMV transaction. So we have the authorization stage. Yeah, I won't go into explaining all of the data elements involved, but certainly the ones I'm displaying there are important. For a contact transaction, there is actually the opportunity, because the card will still be dipped into the terminal, there is an opportunity for the issuer to send back secured messages that the card can then verify. So for example, the issuer will be able to reset all the counters in the card if it wants to. I think that's probably enough for that. You may have noticed I haven't actually mentioned what brand of public key cryptography is used. Don't think I have anyway. It's RSA. But traditionally with EMV, it's very short RSA key lengths. So the exponent is short, either 3. In fact, almost every card I'm aware of uses exponent 3. And the key lengths are all restricted to be less than 1984 bits. So, for example, the payment scheme key at the top of that tree is now maxed out at 1984 bits. It started life as 768 bits. And then over the years, we've moved. Mastercard, for example, introduced an 896-bit key. Then it introduced a 1024-bit key. Actually, Johan remembers all of this. Then an 1152-bit key, then a 1408-bit key. 1408-bit key was finally expired a couple of years ago, and now we're on the 1984-bit key length. So Mastercard has one payment system key of 1984 bits in every terminal in the world that supports offline card authentication. And we estimate that it's got a lifetime to at least 2035. So, and maybe in a few months' time we will extend it to 2036. The other thing I'll mention here about the RSA is the certificates. So Bart talked about PKI. We don't use X509 certificates because these are very constrained devices. They're not as constrained as they used to be, but they are still constrained. So we have very simple certificates, but they're absolutely fit for purpose. They're tailored, so to speak. And they also do something called message recovery, signatures with message recovery, which means that when you sign, when the issuer signs, for example, the card public key, it creates a signature, but actually you can embed the payload of the signature inside the signature itself and save a lot of space. It's quite clever, actually. This was an ISO standard developed back in 1996, and it's been used forever since. On the Symmetric side, for application cryptogram generation, we use 2-key triple DES. Again, there's been a lot of question marks as to whether that is still secure. We do regular and detailed assessments of it, and we believe it is still absolutely fit for purpose. However, we do appreciate that we actually introduced AES into the EMV specs about 15 years ago. We are now seeing AES being adopted, so that's good. Nothing wrong with 2-key triple DES, but AES is the better algorithm, obviously. There have been a variety of attacks and research papers done on EMV security. I'm not going to go through all of these. We do assess the attacks when they're published, and we write papers on them. We publish them. Some are available publicly. Some we restrict to our EMV associates for whatever reasons. We'll talk about some of these on the next slide. So I've got 5 selected attacks. So there's a shim attack whereby, and a lot of these attacks, if not all of them, I think actually were published by Cambridge University over the years. Not so many recently by them, as it happens. But so here in this attack, their shim is put inside the contact reader, and when you put your card into the contact reader, it will read the PIN if the PIN is not encrypted. So that encourages the use of encrypted PIN rather than plain text PIN. Another attack is called the wedge attack, which first came to prominence in France, actually. In this picture here is a picture of a chip on a card, but you'll see there's a raised part in the middle there where a wedge chip has been inserted, and that basically modifies data sent between the terminal and the chip itself, and it can change the card's responses. For example, it can change a response from the card which says the PIN is verified correctly, and it can change that to, sorry, it can change a response saying PIN is not good to saying that the PIN is good. And it can change a response from the card from saying, I want to go online or decline, to saying, I'm happy to stay offline. So CDA is the method to prevent these wedge attacks. There's also an attack on unpredictable numbers. So this is the challenge number, which is a 4-byte challenge number. It was found by Cambridge University researchers again, that some terminals, instead of doing a random unpredictable number, they were doing a predictable unpredictable number. Yeah. And like a timestamp. And so because of that, it meant that the protocol was no good, because you couldn't be sure that the cryptogram coming back from the card actually was fresh. And that's why you wanted an unpredictable number. And then finally, relay attacks. And this is still very much a hot topic, actually. But it was identified, over the years, way before chip transactions, the notion of a relay attack. But anyway, whilst it was identified 10 years ago, it's only more recently that it's become popular and technically viable, although it is still actually very difficult to synchronize. But we do, for our contactless product, have what's called a relay resistance protocol, which can stop this attack. It's not everywhere yet. Some cards in Europe do implement it. It's work in progress, should we say. I now want to focus on contactless and mobile very briefly. Maybe you can see some of this in the slides when they're shared, but this gives some, I think, lists some very good reasons for why contactless is so good. One important thing, though, to notice is this speed limitation for transit transactions. By transit, I mean underground metro transactions, so Transport for London, for example, where you have large crowds during peak rush hour that need to be pushed through the gates very quickly for health and safety reasons. So you need to get the transaction time really quick. And whilst we can do that with today's technology, it's a problem for post-quantum algorithms because of the key sizes and signature sizes are so large for those algorithms. I shall move. Of course, with contactless, you can also do mobile. And there are a variety of flavors of mobile. You can have mobile where the keys, the private keys and the secret keys are in a secure element. And then you can also have them where they're not in a secure element, but they are protected by other means. So that's clearly an area where you have to have different security techniques. What is certainly true, though, is those transactions are all from mobile are always online to the issuer. So an issuer has a very close control over blocking or accepting transactions. And then payment tokenization I mentioned already. Elliptic curve, ironically, over the last few years, starting actually back in 2007, but it took a long time, we only just recently published specs using elliptic curve instead of RSA. The reason why it took so long is complicated. It's another story. But just for your information, we use P256, SHA-256. I don't think there are any live transactions using elliptic curve yet. So it's all very hot off the press. And I'm going to go to the next slide. So this is for contact. For contactless, we instead of having the card creating a digital signature, we have the card and terminal establishing a secure channel using a Diffie-Hellman key exchange. In the obvious way, except there's a twist to this, which is that we use blinded Diffie-Hellman, which means that it's more efficient than other possible ways of doing a Diffie-Hellman, such as station to station. It ensures basically that the public key doesn't have to be exposed in plain text, which is kind of neat, and it means you avoid linkability if there's an eavesdropper. And we also have relay resistance packaged into the elliptic curve secure channel. And that's all available on the EMVCo website. This basically says a bit about how the blinded Diffie-Hellman works. Almost out of time, so I won't go through that. Hopefully that's self-explanatory, though. But what I should do, the elephant in the room, of course, is quantum computers. because quantum computers, in theory, break both elliptic curve and RSA. Now, I've already mentioned that most transactions, not all, but most transactions go online to the issuer and they use symmetric cryptography. In the future, it will be AES. Today, it's two-key triple DES, but the world of EMV is already moving to AES. AES is quantum resistant, even actually without the doubling of key lengths. Furthermore, one of the main drivers for going to post-quantum algorithms was the harvest now, decrypt later threat. So this is where data is encrypted, data that's encrypted using RSA or elliptic curve today is decrypted, say in 10 years' time when quantum computers arrive, or maybe 15 years' time, because it's long life confidential data. But EMV doesn't have long life confidential data. And so we're not vulnerable to the urgency of deploying post-quantum algorithms. We could still maybe want it for authentication, for signatures. But as I just mentioned, most transactions go online. It's only the very low value transactions that are offline. And so it's not so urgent. And just for your information here, we've got for transit, because of the communication speed, 106,000 bits per second of the contactless, and because of the huge key sizes and signature sizes of post-quantum algorithms, we can't get anywhere close to being within 400 milliseconds. So that's a problem. We've got some ideas as to how to solve it. Main one probably being either to use symmetric max or to simply use the new post-quantum signature algorithms for the certificates, but not at the card level. So the card level would still use RSA or elliptic curve, but it would be, the whole protocol would be augmented by two new post-quantum certificates. But anyway, so there are ways we can move in order to deal with quantum computers as and when they arrive. More information on the status for EMV and quantum can be found on the EMVCO website. And that's my final slide. Any questions? Anything else? Okay, in that case, thank you, and I'll let you have your tea.